Where do you find the next percentages in your negotiation? When the classic negotiation variables are exhausted, where do you then find new value through collaboration, partnership, and new perspectives? Today, we explore this through a concrete case from Dagrofa and Øllingegaard. Our host is Tina Anberg, founder of Creosum and a certified SMARTnership negotiator with experience in negotiation and collaboration. With her is Stefan Andersen, an experienced specialist in procurement and category management. He works with assortment, supplier collaboration, price and contract negotiations, as well as commercial planning. He has many years of experience from Dagrofa and AC Nielsen and holds a master's degree in marketing management from Copenhagen Business School. Our other guest is Nelly Riggelsen, sales and marketing manager at Naturmælk and Øllingegaard. She works with sales, marketing, product development, and customer partnerships with a focus on organic products, sustainability, and the reduction of food waste. As a food architect, she translates the dairy's expertise into products and solutions that create value in the market. Together, they will explore how to create new value and develop negotiations into stronger partnerships. Let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to all of you who have found the time to participate in today's webinar. I have personally been looking forward to this very much because I have two very exciting guests with me here today. Stefan Andersen from Dagrofa and Nelly Riggelsen from Øllingegaard. And the special thing about today's event and today's webinar is that we are actually represented from both the purchasing side and also from the supplier side. Often we only have our success stories from one side of the table, but I think it is quite unique that we now have both Stefan and Nelly with us. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
And what we are going to talk about today, well, it is, as you just heard in the intro video, what do you do when there is a buyer on one side of the table who needs to squeeze out a few more percentage points, and there is a supplier on the other side of the table who thinks there is nothing more to give? And those are the two perspectives that we are going to hear about. You are, of course, very welcome to ask questions in the chat, and we will try to answer them to the best of our ability. But before we get started, well, Stefan, wouldn't you like to say a few words about that situation and maybe give us a little bit of background regarding the collaboration with Øllingegaard and Nelly?
Yes, I would like to do that. Well, my name is Stefan and I have been at Dagrofa for, well, at least almost 18 years and have always worked with category management and negotiation. And we have, among others, Øllingegaard and Naturmælk as one of our good, one could say, partners. I've kind of stopped using the word supplier because Nelly, of course, supplies products to us in the form of dairy products and cheese. But we see both Nelly and also Øllingegaard much more as a partner. And that is also how we approach the negotiations. It is still difficult to be in a negotiation, so you also have to remember to be able to accommodate that. The fact that seeking improvements never goes out of style. Talking about cost prices and talking about margins never goes out of style either, and it shouldn't. So that is, of course, still what has our top priority and what is very easy to measure, whether you are a success or a failure. But we have tried to look at things, nuance them a bit, and tried to see them in a slightly different light. And I have been working together with Nelly for at least the last 6 years. So it is also about the fact that we really know each other well. But you could say, just to set the scene, we are being met with the requirement that we need to achieve improvements. We need to sharpen our attractiveness to our customers. We want to ensure that our grocers get an improved earning capacity, and our suppliers really need to help a great deal with that. And that is where I come into play as category manager and buyer for dairy and cheese.
Exactly. And Nelly, maybe you can also just briefly give your side, meaning what your relationship is towards Dagrofa and Stefan, before I jump a bit into the case you were facing.
Yes, I would like to do that. Well, it's a super good relationship and a strong relationship that we have managed to build up through, yes, actually since 2017 to 18, where we have developed this from being more of a formalized collaboration to a very strong collaboration over the years. And you could say it is both easy and not quite so easy. But when you sit down for these annual negotiations, I think perhaps the starting point is also a bit different, at least for my part. And I think that's also the case for Stefan, in the sense that we see more than just now. He also sees that they have stopped using the supplier, the term supplier. I don't use customer terms anymore either. I mean, we have this form of collaboration, and I think that that is reflected in the way that we approach negotiations. That we see each other and we look at each other. We don't have this somewhat one-sided view, which one might often have when one doesn't know the partner that well.
Yes, thank you for that. Perhaps I can just add, for those of you who don't know what Øllingegaard is a dairy that supplies dairy products, and Dagrofa is an organization that has a number of supermarket chains. So the relationship between them is, of course, Stefan, you have to buy for your chains, and Nelly, you are a supplier on the dairy side to Dagrofa. But let's dive right in, because the excitement is, of course, high. And I can say that Stefan and the entire Dagrofa team have previously gone through a training course where we looked into commercial negotiations. How do you approach negotiations in a more collaborative way? And that is exactly what you are also describing here, how you actually collaborate and no longer speak in terms of a supplier-customer relationship, but rather, to a greater extent, a collaborative partnership. So, Stefan, if we may start with you, what kind of task were you facing with the negotiation that you were about to go into or look into with Nelly?
Well, we are facing a task where we have been with or visiting Nelly here at Øllingegaard for many, many years, where we have had to find improvements from year to year in order to strengthen our competitiveness. So that certainly makes the matter more difficult, that year after year you have to be able to secure improvements, typically in the form of lower prices for our grocers and chains.
And you then had to go out and secure savings at Nelly's and presumably present that you needed to secure a saving. How did you approach that?
Well, what I normally always do is to get hold of Nelly relatively quickly in the process and, well, lay the cards on the table and tell her a bit about what kind of challenge we are facing. So instead of turning it inward and thinking it's unreasonable that management is setting such high demands for us, I choose to say that this is an expectation that we can solve the things that are placed in front of us. And so instead of going around struggling with it myself, I try to be open and transparent with Nelly and say that this is what I need. We work with some concepts that we also call, most desired outcome, but also least acceptable agreement in relation to whether one can accept less than what one is aiming for. It's very classic in negotiations to cast the anchor quite far out, because then you can at least hopefully achieve some of it. Just like if you are negotiating a price when you are traveling, that's a very classic negotiation, but also a very one-sided type of negotiation if you're going to buy some item, if you're at a marketplace. But this is a completely different setting, and it starts many years before in terms of having trust in each other. So when I tell Nelly that this is what I am in the market to acquire, then I hope that Nelly has enough trust in me to know that it is true and that I am not bluffing or lying or trying to be greedy just to get an extra pat on the back or a round of applause when we are gathered to share experiences in our purchasing forum here at Dagrofa, but that I can actually maintain that trusting distance. And we can sort of start from the beginning and then figure out how we move towards the goal, and not just keep price in mind, but try to be more nuanced based on these negotiation variables instead of just thinking about it very one-sidedly as price.
And Stefan, what did you expect would be difficult in this dialogue now that you had to go out and ask for a price reduction again?
Well, it's basically everything that's difficult, because I know that I'm creating a dynamic and a field of tension, which isn't pleasant to be in for either side of the table. I find it difficult both to have to go out and sort of ask for or demand or I want. And at the same time, yes, due to my empathy, also in relation to Nelly, I also know well that it's not easy to sit on the other side and have to make things work in a production environment where there are higher costs, there are higher wages, transport. There are many things that are rising, packaging. We are also talking about EPR, extended producer responsibility. So there are many there are many variables that determine the price of a product. But with this thing about getting out in good time, and sort of getting the task we need to solve together addressed, but also to show that, what can you say, openness and transparency in relation to that, we actually believe in it. So there is both something purely physical in it, but there is also something purely mental in being on the same wavelength regarding the task we are about to start.
Yes, well, thank you, Stefan. And I would actually like to come back to that part in a moment. But before that, I would just like to hear from your side, Nelly. How did you experience this whole situation when Stefan came out and said, so it's time to reduce the price again?
I would say that you always start by doing your homework. I mean, when you go into this kind of negotiation, you spend a really long time thinking through various scenarios. And of course, you've done that, knowing full well. You never know what numbers you're going to be presented with. But having said that, I think for once I was a bit sharp right from the start and said that it was out of the question, if I remember correctly, Stefan. But on the other hand, then we turned around, or I turned around, or we both turned around and said, we have to try looking at alternative options. Because this thing about just being presented with an amount or a percentage or whatever it might be, that's not all there is to it. I mean, that's not it. Basically, that's not what it's about. That we as suppliers are met year after year with demands for improvements in the partnership, the partner's business. After all things being equal, we also have the same cost that we are faced with. So I think we were pretty quick to look into it and say, well, right off the bat, that's not an amount we're going to hand over. But we are going to look at an alternative method to look into. How can we optimize the two businesses? Because I have an understanding. I have an understanding for the partners facing Stefan, who I am sitting across from, that he needs to make it more profitable. He also needs to bring in X amount of money. But on the other hand, as companies, we always have some form of waste or something else, some alternative forms we can go in and look at. How can we then optimize the overall picture? That's really what it's all about. It's not just about giving, it's about both giving and receiving.
Exactly. You are hitting on a quite interesting theme here, because there are guaranteed to be many people listening who are thinking that is exactly what I am being met with. If you are sitting as a purchaser, then you know that well. There are targets. How much do we need to reduce the price? And then you have to go out to your supplier and get a reduction. Conversely, the supplier is standing on the other side. How can you manage not to give away all your profit and just unilaterally hand it all over? So this is interesting. Now, you're both speaking a bit into this immediately. Well, we're just not willing to just give it all away. We immediately reject that there should be a price reduction. How did you actually change this dynamic? You mentioned a couple of times, Stefan, to look at some other variables, Nelly. You've said to look at some other things, which is actually one of the things we talk a lot about. How can you expand the palette of elements we look at in a negotiation so it doesn't just become a conversation about price? Because I think there are many people here who can nod in recognition of either being the one who has said the price is too high or the one who has sat on the other side and been told that. So what do you do in practice when you're in this situation and you need to change the situation? Stefan.
Well, I actually think, as Nelly says, I think we actually reached a crossroads from the traditional sort of zero-sum game. And as Nelly says, I think that both of us, it was quite clear to us that I come along hoping that Nelly will still give me the money I need. And then Nelly says, now it's enough. Now we're closing the till. Now there is 0 kroner. We don't want to be part of this anymore. And I think both of us were a bit like that. As she says, Nelly, a wake-up call. Probably a bit for both of us, because we were probably frustrated with the situation we had ended up in and were having a hard time getting out of it. And then I think both of us went into a mental thinking box, and I was lucky enough to be connected to the educational stage that you have, Tina, through Creos, and this thing called SMARTnership, which specifically encourages you to try to think more nuanced and think more holistically. So that was very good timing, and it actually meant that I started suggesting to Nelly, can we look at some other parts of our business that we haven't normally looked at, including shrinkage and logistics? It could also be innovation. We were also in there looking to find out what actually lies in the different streets that we haven't walked down so much together. The good thing about that, and also to return to the topic of trust, was that Nelly quickly caught on to that idea and played along. So we were both, in a way, open to saying, yes, let's try to be curious and look into some of those areas to see if we can optimize anything. And the difficult part of that is also getting it valued, because it's one thing to say, yes, there might be some money here, but actually putting a value on it, saying, what do we actually think is there? And there I have to give credit back to Nelly. She was brave and dared to say, well, we have tried to value some of the various other elements, like some logistics, for example, that we were working on, which we have also looked at previously. But now we could go a bit deeper into it, because I told Nelly that if we find some money, I don't want to be greedy and take all the money. It's better that we don't find anything at all. And if we start having that attitude that we might have to part ways, then we would rather try to see what we can uncover. And then we have to figure out how we should split the money that we can then uncover. But let's try to be open in our approach to getting some other areas of the business valued. And then we might have been both lucky and skilled, because that suddenly meant that some light started to be shed on the negotiation, so it doesn't become so cramp-like about everything being about price, but that suddenly you could also talk about something else along the way.
What made you feel that you could actually trust Stefan when he came and said, let's open up for some other variables? Let's see if we can find some more value together. And I promise you, I won't take it all. How? How did this whole thing start?
Well, we have a relationship that goes way back. And I would say the person I trusted, Stefan. I do. And when it's said that the amount is a percentage, then I also think that's what it is. I believe that too. The whole foundation for sitting in an honest negotiation is this honesty and trust-based approach, because we have a shared task. So I really wasn't in doubt about that. And I also think that thing about asking directly, because everyone dreams big, and that goes for a buyer too. Or someone sitting in the negotiation also dreams big, that it could be wonderful with, but perhaps an amount that is stated higher than what one actually needs. So this concrete thing of saying, what is it we are actually talking about? What is the amount we have? Or what is it we need? What is a percentage rate? And then try to put on these holistic glasses and actually look through the companies. And now it is me on the supplier side. Go in and look at those waste processes. There is always waste. There is always waste in every company. It could be overproduction. It could be underproduction. It could be all sorts of campaigns that aren't performing, or the logistics, which we are very specifically looking at regarding order flow and everything. There are all sorts of elements and resources. What resources are being used by the two organizations? So go in and get some things valued. In other words, put numbers on it and say, what could we actually eliminate of this if we were really skilled? And what is our optimal picture of a negotiation situation that we are actually in? So there were absolutely no concerns regarding Stefan. I also feel that I know him well professionally, and I think that's it. It's a really good starting point to have this, that you need to be able to trust each other. You are sitting in this room. We do some things.
You mentioned some quite interesting things here, which I'll just pick up on as well, because if we have anyone listening who doesn't know what that is. Stefan, you started by saying classic zero-sum game, zero-sum, which precisely means that if Stefan is to win 100 kroner, well, then it will be at Nelly's expense. In other words, she has to pay 100 kroner so that Stefan can get 100 kroner more. So that is the classic zero-sum. Whereas what you are describing here, and you mentioned SMARTnership, Stefan, is to a greater extent an approach where one looks at cooperation, where one desires more openness and more transparency. As you also describe here that you say, Nelly, I actually trust that when Stefan comes and says, let's just play with the number 5%, then it is more tangible that he needs to use 5%. Well, then you trust that it is the right number. And we have done a lot of research on trust as well. And what is the value of trust? We often meet people who say that it can be difficult to price, and that is true. It can be difficult to price, but studies also show that we are willing to pay up to 34% more to do business with someone we trust than someone we do not trust. And that is an interesting topic now that we are talking about, well, what is the significance of trust, and can we trust a partner? You started by saying, Stefan, that historically one might have set an anchor high, because then we know that we will land somewhere around there where we can accept the result we get. And that is actually the opposite approach, meaning that you have good personal chemistry, that you trust the people you are sitting across from and can actually, in a more open and transparent way, open up about what variables we could look at, meaning the total package instead of just looking at price. Now, you mentioned here, Nelly, that there is waste and there is logistics and various other elements you could look into. Had you talked beforehand about what kind of variables we should look at? Can we actually price them? You said, Stefan, that Nelly came well prepared to your meeting. Had you made any efforts beforehand to ensure that?
Well, we had. I mean, we had tried to create a clear agenda, but I think it got a bit disrupted because we had to try to be a little creative. But what we did was that we divided it into some groups just to try to keep some order on the different variables. Because the challenge here is that moving into a new area takes time, and that's something we don't really have that much of, considering that when negotiations need to happen, we want to do it within a certain time frame. Once negotiations conclude, we need to return to operating or growth mode, if you will. But I think we found out that we could quickly sense that there was something to be gained. Then we started to sort of categorize our variables a bit. So we had something regarding our scheduling, and we had something regarding our entire driving part, and we also had something regarding our turning part. And then we started to sort of go a bit deeper into the different parts to say, what are we talking about when we get into the subcategories? And then try to value them to see, is there any money in any of this? For example, also in relation to overproduction, which Nelly talks about, and that is not something that we are aware of. We do order the goods we need. What is there more or less of? We also have lean at our terminals, so we work based on being as highly efficient as possible based on the KPIs in place at the warehouses regarding having the goods we need, especially when it comes to dairy products with shorter shelf life, neither too much nor too little, with a fine forecast, both in relation to campaigns and in relation to normal sales. So the fact that Nelly suddenly had to say, listen here, we are actually producing something that, if you can put it a bit bluntly, actually just ends up being thrown straight out, because our production capacity is at a higher level on some of the products than what you are actually taking. So already there, we were on our way to putting 2 and 2 together and saying, hold on, we should try to see if we can get something changed. And that's not something you just do, because it also requires us to change some of our planning routines in relation to the way we then have to order goods from Nelly. And it also requires that we have a slightly different workflow and different behavior. So things are definitely not black and white. And this is certainly not a quick fix we are dealing with here. But that thing about working with things, and as we say, we are owned by Norgesgruppen. It's this stone by stone approach where you're constantly adding a little level on top, and you gain more and more knowledge from day to day. So through that, you can start to put together this quite complicated puzzle that we were working on.
Exactly. A question came in here about how many variables you ended up negotiating on. Now, you have already given some examples of what kind of variables those were.
And there are 4, 5, 6 of them.
Yes, we have.
The ones you used to negotiate on.
Yes.
Well, what I actually did as a good piece of advice for everyone listening was that I am very much into the current trends at the moment. And we are also using both chat and co-pilots. Simply go in and try to have a dialogue about the concept of negotiation variables and try to be curious. It is also very much in vogue to try to be curious about what it comes back with and figure it out. How does that actually fit the organization you are currently in? Because it listed 50 variables very quickly, which made you think, wow. And then you have to start figuring out what actually fits. And the challenge here is that you are very often so biased, because I have been negotiating for the last, at least 18 years. I have had over 500 negotiations in my time through Dagrofa, so I have really negotiated a lot. And yet you have some fixed ways and some fixed routines and habits that you do things by, and you think some things work better than others because you have physical proof of that. But this thing about trying to be a little more open-minded in terms of saying, could this also be something, and then actually being able to try it out. That is, together with Nelly, in a physical environment where you can actually test and find out, is there something to some of these things that we have got hold of? So, and then I have a bit of luck and a bit of experience and a bit of good sense. Then suddenly we came into it from a different angle.
And when could you sort of see, okay, we are starting to see the outlines of an agreement here?
Well, for my part, it was definitely when a value was put on it, then I could really see that there was something that was worth a lot of money where I thought, wow, that was really surprising.
We actually found more than we needed. Sticker, that was also.
Yes, we did. We did. Not exactly on purpose, but it was, of course. It just showed that we really had something, and we are still cultivating it. This is a recurring phenomenon. And now, yes, now we are starting, as mentioned, again, in terms of laying all the stones for 2027. So we continue down the path that Nelly and I have found. And it is certainly not just Nelly and Øllingegaard who need to change their behavior. It is just as much us or me, and also our warehouse and our logistics. And there have also been a few tough blows there in terms of trying to reach a consensus on the things we are trying to do. And it requires, when you talk now, you mentioned this SMARTnership earlier, that many people are not familiar with that concept. So this thing about setting the ground rules or setting the framework in relation to talking about trust is also incredibly interesting when you are sitting across from a supplier and asking, to what extent do I earn your trust? And if the supplier says, well, I'm actually quite nervous that you're about to screw me over. Okay, interesting. Then you can sort of take that as a starting point and figure out what on earth it takes to do what you say and say what you do and all that. Trust is shown over the many years where you actually also help each other. If you are really challenged or you are in trouble, that is where you can really create some strong trust in each other.
And there you touch on something really interesting, and actually one of my personal favorite areas. You say set the ground rules, that is the framework for how we should negotiate before we start negotiating. While it may sound like a very easy task, what I see repeatedly when I work with many of our clients is that it is one of the most difficult areas, and at the same time, one of the most significant areas for the outcome of the negotiation. That is that you talk early on about what kind of direction we want with this negotiation. Can we be open? Can we be transparent? Do we want to jointly find more variables and share our costs and our gains and see if we can find some value? And as you just said, Nelly, you actually found more value, and you found significantly more value, in fact, than what you were required to in your negotiation, where if you hadn't changed the approach to it, well, then we see that it's just thrown away, meaning the parties might just walk away. Both parties leave the table thinking they've reached a good enough deal, but they haven't uncovered the full potential at all. And it's precisely this full potential that we're interested in finding in order to achieve better agreements. And back to the rules of the game you discussed beforehand. Let's play further with the idea that it was 5% you asked for, Stefan, in price reduction. Did you then talk about what you should do with the value you found? So, had you agreed that first Stefan would get his 5% price reduction and then Nelly got the rest, or you'd share it? Or how did you handle that?
No, we didn't talk about that beforehand. We talked about it along the way. Nelly, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Isn't that right?
Yes, I also think we suddenly found much more than what we actually needed. So we suddenly had, it might sound a bit crazy, but suddenly actually the opposite problem. Because what also sometimes happens is that when you present a good result, that becomes the new plateau, and then you set a new target from there. So we had to figure out how to balance that, because we're both quite experienced. We know that in about a year's time, we'll meet again, and we'll do so in 2 years and in 3 years. So being able to set a more long-term strategy based on what we had here was also interesting, because we actually had to look out for ourselves and each other. And it wasn't so much about getting a pat on the back for handling the negotiation. It's just as much about looking out for Nelly and looking out for Stefan, so that we can maintain a high degree of, you could say, value for ourselves, since we meet all the time now, as you do continuously on these negotiation platforms.
Mm-hmm. So how can you reveal how you ended up distributing this greater value that you found? I mean, what did you do?
Yes, well, I suppose you could say that I finally received the full amount of money that I had originally asked for. And then after that, I also made sure to say to Nelly And I know this might sound a bit, perhaps a bit provocative or even blunt, but I told her quite clearly, I really don't need any more than this. I'm quite satisfied with what I have. I only need what I asked for. I shouldn't have more. And that might be a bit asking for trouble, since some would say, hey, but I did that because I know this is a long-term partnership. So I told Nelly, keep everything else we found, and then we'll modify and develop so we can understand each other even better, because it's a bit of a new area to enter. So things like waste, for example, and overproduction. When you produce different types of goods on different days, that was something I had to learn to understand more. And we still have a big task in our allocation in terms of them also having to take the quantities that are produced. And we also have to be honest and say that we're not at the finish line yet. So it's not just like everything is running smoothly for us. It still requires a lot of information and massaging in various places in our value chain, because we're a large organization in terms of getting people to understand and try to lean out a bit and take some chances. What we've found is that instead of taking the whole elephant at once, you take a small bite of it. So we're trying to start with some test areas where we can actually gain some experience. Because if people are nervous, those who are planning, and they have KPI numbers too, that they can better handle it and feel a bit more secure that now we're trying some areas. But we actually have a meeting again tomorrow with logistics and also with transport to get even closer to each other. And there I can feel that a behavioral change has happened since we spoke with them before the summer holidays. So you can feel that some movements are happening, but it's just as much internal trust as it is trust towards Nelly, actually. So that's also quite interesting when you get that experience.
Yes.
It's super interesting because it's actually very much about partly a behavioral change, but I also usually say it's about changing the mindset. That we've been used to negotiating in one way for a long time, where we like to keep our cards close to our chest. We think that the fact that the person we're sitting across from has a lot of information is a disadvantage for us. It's where you're actually proving the opposite here. The fact that you're opening up and being honest about what you're facing has created greater value for both parties. And also that you haven't really, as you started by saying, Stefan, been greedy and said, well, then I'll take it all. And that's one of the things when I'm out with my clients or holding workshops and saying, well, you might have been in a partnership that is the collaboration-oriented approach for a while, but there's a big risk once we've found all the values. If you haven't already talked about how we should actually distribute them, who should have what? Who carries a risk? What should happen? Where here you've shown that the long-term cooperation and the fact that you're mutually dependent on each other, that this has also been taken into account. And when we just had a short talk here before we went on the webinar, Nelly, you also mentioned an approach that you usually use with some of your buyers, where you said, what is your task? Would you like to try to put a few words on how that can also be disarming?
Yes, I can do that. Well, it's basically, that was also what I started by saying. It's about having a dream, and maybe you have a dream scenario, but it's important to talk into that. Because knowing Stefan he's a buyer, but he also there are some requirements defined from somewhere, probably a bit higher up in the organization, I would imagine. So this thing about actually talking into it and saying, well, what is it really? What is it that you need? Well, it might be that you say, now you said 5%, but it could be that the actual figure is 3.2. So let's try to see if we can narrow it down so that it's the 3.2 we're talking about. Because all else being equal, that would make the task easier. So I think this here. But again, the space must be honest, and it must be based on trust. When you have those conversations and you have those negotiations, but it's about actually getting this clarified and a precise figure on the table. I think that's important, because I know that every time I go to a negotiation, I'm met with something, and the person I'm sitting across from has been given a task, and there's a minimum acceptable level, and we have to figure that out together. And it's this understanding, and we as a supplier, we can't just give and give. So we have to rethink this whole negotiation process by saying, what is it that we two parties actually want to get out of this meeting together? And how can we get it closed as quickly as possible? We know that too. We should ideally be in agreement when we leave the meeting, so we don't have to deal with something after the good vibes have settled, hopefully. So I think that's it. yes, that's the approach I have. We have here before us to precisely figure out how to solve the task in collaboration and not just think of it as us having to give an amount. But we must optimize and find an amount together that corresponds to.
Yes, very good. Very good input. I'd just like to remind all our listeners that you're welcome to ask questions to Stefan and Nelly, and to me for that matter. If you have any questions about the case before, I think we should reveal what kind of result you also achieved without putting precise figures on it. I've promised not to reveal those, and I also know that there's a much greater potential that at least wasn't included in the figures we looked at the time when we talked about this case. So I think it would be interesting to hear. Let me just see if a question came in here. That it's very much about, it's being written in the comments, that it's also very much about the internal reaction, that is a change in the company, that you have to understand that we actually dare to behave differently with our suppliers because you actually reached a result that was 11% better than what was targeted. And honestly, I really do think that is a huge, significant achievement. For lack of a better word, you've succeeded in something big compared to what you were actually targeted for, and there was much more you could find and negotiate on. So from moving to entering a negotiation where you, Stefan, asked for a 1% reduction in price, Nelly, you say there's no more to give if we're also to survive as a company. And we know very well that there's no reason to pressure your suppliers so much that they potentially go bankrupt. Neither of the parties benefits from that. So finding other ways to identify potential. And here you've actually shown in the best way how, by looking at several variables and working together, you can find solutions to achieve much greater savings overall. That is, as both supplier and buyer in collaboration. And I think you deserve some recognition for succeeding in that and for also getting your respective internal organizations on board. So before we're close to wrapping up, I'm a bit curious to also hear from you. If you were to give a few takeaways to our viewers here, maybe 3 things that you think they can go out and do right away, or that you believe make the biggest difference. Would you like to try and share those? Stefan, would you like to start?
I'll just go before Nelly. Yeah. Not because I have to speak every time a question comes up, but what was certainly interesting for me is that sometimes when you ask about an area and then our partners say there's nothing to be found here, if you say, but is there any possibility to talk about logistics? And then they say, no, we've optimized there. There's nothing to be found there. That you somehow get that dialogue opened up, and that's really difficult. But that thing about both having an interest in really trying to go into some areas where you both can feel, if you're experienced, you can sometimes feel it in your gut. There's actually some money to be found here in one way or another. We just need to turn it around, and then you sort of stay persistent and you're brave and you dare to go into depth with it, and you also take the time for it. And then, of course, we were lucky that we suddenly found some good pockets with quite a lot of money in them. And it wasn't certain that we would, but just the fact that we kept being curious about going deep into it, that turned out to be really interesting, instead of just dismissing it with a quick comment like, I don't think there's anything there. But actually, it could very well be that there is something there. Yes, we just need to have that investigated. We just need to turn over the stones. And often when you shine a light on some areas, you can see then much more comes out than you might think yourself. So that was certainly a very big eye-opener for me. And then if I'm to give a few pieces of advice, something I've found, certainly this thing about using a whiteboard, if you have one, or writing down on a piece of paper so you can see the things you agree on along the way. Because I've often noticed that you think you're saying something but you think yourself that you've said it, but the listener has heard something completely different. So this thing about using the whiteboard, that's really something I've taken to heart. And then the last thing for my part, this thing about summarizing as you go, I can easily sit in a 2-hour meeting without making a single summary because I know I'm facing professional people. So, of course, everyone has heard and thought and reflected the same way I have. And, of course, they haven't. So this thing about summarizing along the way has really given me some interesting insights where you think, okay, I can hear that you haven't quite caught what I was trying to say before. which I actually think had a high value in our collaboration. And then you have to go back a bit. So use the board and write down the different variables you find, and at the same time summarize the meeting as you go.
I think those are some really good reflections. When you say use the board, it's also about actually collaborating. Both parties can see how far we're getting, which also creates a high degree of trust. Thanks for those points. Before I jump to you to hear 3 things from you. A question has come in for you, Stefan, about what you saw as the biggest challenge in the changed approach from Dagrofa internally. Please let us know if there are any questions or concerns that you might have. Did mine actually go out there, Stefan? Could you check for me?
No, I can hear you.
Oh,
Sorry, who are you asking the question to, Tine?
it's for you. A question has come in for you, Stefan, about what you saw as the biggest challenge in the changed approach from Dagrofa.
Yes, well, it's that things take time, and this takes a long time, and you have to be early, and you never have enough time, I think. So that's the hardest part for me. It's having the time, because it's not like there isn't operations on the side, and emails and phone calls and problems and bosses and colleagues and employees who want to take your time. So it's something completely different compared to this shift tasking and multitasking concept. You really try to be conscious about using your time correctly. It's something else entirely compared to time optimization and efficiency, which is probably another webinar. But it's mostly that I can feel. That's been the hardest so far.
Yes. Yes. Thanks for sharing that perspective, Nelly. 3 things you want to give our viewers from here that they can learn from.
Yes, first of all, I actually think that as a supplier, we should always be positive when we're invited to annual negotiations. Because just the fact that we're invited to an annual negotiation actually says something about our importance as a supplier. So that's the first mindset you need to have. You shouldn't fear that you'll walk in the door and just be met with some random number. That being said, that is definitely rule number 1. Number 2, do your homework. I mean, prepare yourself for the fact that you're going into a negotiation. You can't just not care. You have to look at your business from a 360-degree perspective. Look at the processes that might irritate you in this partnership. And when I say irritate, that equals waste, which equals costing money. Go in and create this little overview for yourself and say, okay, this partnership, this relationship, on the surface, it's going fine, but we actually have costs attached to it. It could be all sorts of things. Now, we're a manufacturing company and we produce just in time, so we might be unique compared to other companies. But for us, there are definitely some parameters that are very, very important for us to achieve optimal operations in what we do. So that's basically number 2. And then number 3. Then I think it's this thing that Stefan and I have practiced. Be honest, be open, look at everything, look at the alternative solutions that are available, and then want the best for each other. This understanding, I mean, the space of understanding you enter where you understand that you'll be met with something. But conversely, there's also understanding towards the supplier to come up with alternative solutions, because everything can be solved where there's goodwill. At least that's my starting point. And I also think that this thing about us having a supplier-customer relationship, which I'm using now but wouldn't normally use, it also reflects that there's a relationship that needs to be strengthened going forward. So I think having a positive attitude when you come into a negotiation is pretty crucial. So you have an open mindset and you're not sitting there fearing something, but taking it as a positive meeting.
Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives. I think you're really touching on something here, Nelly, that it's not just about talking about working in a partnership or collaboration, but actually practicing it in the way you approach the negotiation. And then I think I'll just say in closing, congratulations on the great result. I mean, 11% better than the target. I think that's worth taking my hat off to. Well done. And thank you so much to both of you for being willing to participate and spend time here, sharing specifically how you've handled a negotiation. I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for that. And thank you so much to all of you who have been out there listening. You're still welcome to ask questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer to the best of our ability afterwards. So have a great day out there, and thanks for now.